The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet. My son-in-law slid a folder across the table toward me the way you'd slide a plate of food toward a child who isn't hungry. Mom, he said he'd started calling me Mom that year, which I never asked him to do. We think it's time you and Robert step back. Let us handle the money side. It's a lot for someone your age. Around that table, every face was already nodding. My daughter Sarah. Marcus, the young accountant David had hired, staring at his own hands like they might offer him a way out. And Kevin the lawyer, David had brought a smooth young man in a good suit with a leather portfolio open in front of him, a stack of papers inside it already arranged, and waiting a notary stamp clipped to the front, like a period at the end of a sentence that hadn't been written yet. Kevin would not quite meet my eyes. He had the look of a man who knew exactly what room he was in, and had decided somewhere on the drive over that it was better not to know. They had decided, all of them, before I ever walked through that door, that I was a sweet old woman who used to keep the books back when keeping books meant a pencil and a ledger and a good night's sleep. They had arranged the papers and brought the notary stamp and chosen their words with the particular care people use when they are being kind to someone they have already written off. What they did not know was that the night before I had sat at my kitchen table until 2 a.m. with 35 years of those ledgers and a pot of coffee strong enough to raise the dead. And they did not know what I had found in them, so I folded my hands on top of my own folder, plain manila, nothing to look at, and I smiled the smile I had been practicing in the mirror for 2 weeks. And I said, "Before I sign anything, David, may I ask you just one question about Piedmont Logistics Partners?" I watched the color run out of his face, not all at once, slowly the way water runs out of a cracked basin, and I am going to tell you exactly how we got there, because it didn't start in that room. It started 35 years before it in a tin-roofed building off 7th Avenue that flooded twice the first spring. It started with a word. The word was rest. Hello again, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is the place where I read the stories you send me. Real stories from real women who have lived long enough to have something worth telling. This week's story comes from a viewer named Linda. She is 67 years old, and she lives in Hendersonville, North Carolina, right up against the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the air smells like pine and cut lumber. Linda wrote to me a few months ago, and I'll be honest with you, her letter sat with me a long time. Because it's about something so many of us carry quietly, that feeling of being talked over, being managed, being treated like your best years and your best thinking are somewhere behind you on the road. Linda gave me her blessing to share this in her own words, and she asked me to tell you right up front that she is not a victim, and she never was. So if you have ever sat in a room and felt people decide who you are before you opened your mouth, pour yourself something warm, settle in, and stay with me. This one is for you. Here is Linda's story, just as she told it to me. My name is Linda Johnson. I am 67 years old, and I have balanced a checkbook to the penny every single month since I was 19 years old. I don't say that to brag. I say it because for 35 years, balancing things to the penny was my job, and I was very, very good at it. There are women who knit, and women who garden, and women who can walk into a kitchen and feed 12 people out of what looks like nothing. I am a woman who can look at a column of numbers and tell you almost before I've finished looking which one is lying. I don't know how to explain the sensation to someone who hasn't felt it. It's something like hearing a wrong note in a song you've known all your life. The number sits in the column, and the column sits in the page, and something in your chest says no, not that one. That one doesn't belong before your eyes have even finished reading the line. My husband Robert and I built a business in Hendersonville called Johnson Building Supply. Lumber hardware, paint roofing, and the little brass fittings that nobody can ever find anywhere else in the county. We opened it the year after we married in that tin-roofed building off 7th Avenue, and we grew it board by board into something that fed 3 families besides our own. Robert was the face of it. He was tall and easy to like, and he could sell a man a deck he hadn't planned on building, and have him shaking Robert's hand and thanking him on the way out the door. People in 3 counties knew Robert Johnson by his first name. They'd stop him at the diner at church at the Saturday market to ask his advice about a leaking gutter or a warped subfloor, and he'd stand there in the produce aisle drawing the fix on the back of a receipt free of charge, because that was simply who he was. He gave advice the way other men gave directions freely and without keeping score, and I was the one in the back office. I did the books. All of them. Payroll accounts, payable accounts receivable, the quarterly taxes, the vendor contracts, the insurance, the bank. When a contractor's check bounced, I was the one who called him kindly the first time, a good deal less kindly the second. When the bank wanted to talk about our line of credit, they talked to me because if they talked to Robert, he'd have agreed to anything just to keep the conversation friendly. Robert could charm the bark off a tree, but he had no gift at all for saying no to a man who was looking him in the eye and asking nicely, and I had learned this about him the same year we opened the store and chose to love it about him rather than fix it. We made a good team that way. Robert out front in the sunshine, me in the back with the ledgers. He used to say I was the keel of the ship and he was just the sail. And I'd tell him a sail without a keel is just laundry flapping on a windy day. That joke never once stopped making him laugh in 44 years of marriage. He'd put his hand flat on the office door on his way out to the yard. The door with our name on it. Johnson, gold letters I'd had done the year we paid the place off, and he'd say, "Hold down the fort keel." Now I want to tell you about two things because they both matter later, and I want you to have them before you need them. The first is the rule. 30 years ago, a bookkeeper 2 towns over robbed her employer blind. One small signature at a time, month after month, until there was nothing left but a padlocked door and a bewildered man who'd trusted her with everything and never once thought to look. I read about it in the county paper over my morning coffee, and by the time I'd finished the article, I had already decided what I was going to do. I drove to the bank that same afternoon, and I sat down with our account manager, a man named Walt Hennessy, and I told him what I wanted. Any payment over $5,000 required 2 signatures, Robert's and mine, the only 2 authorized names on that account. Not the bookkeeper, not the manager, not the man in the moon. Robert and me. More than that, I had Walt draw up what's called a corporate resolution, a formal document filed with the bank spelling out the rule in writing. Not a handshake arrangement. Not a gentleman's agreement. A piece of paper with signatures and a bank stamp that meant the rule existed whether or not anyone remembered it existed. I brought it home and put a copy in my filing cabinet and another in the fireproof box in the basement, and I thought, there. Now it's real. Robert grumbled about it sometimes when he wanted to cut a check fast and couldn't find me. I never once bent on it. Not in 30 years. A rule you bend is not a rule. It's a suggestion. And suggestions are only as good as the mood of the person who hears them. The second thing is the filing cabinet. Robert used to tease me that if our house ever burned to the ground, the only thing left standing in the ashes would be my filing cabinet. I kept 7 years of every record the way the tax man likes, and a good deal of it far longer than that, because that is simply who I am. Down in our basement, under one bare bulb, there is a row of banker's boxes with every invoice, every contract, every vendor file, every canceled check this business ever produced. Every piece of correspondence with the bank, including that corporate resolution, still in its original envelope, with Walt's handwriting on the outside. Robert called it my paper graveyard. I called it insurance. Those 2 things, the rule and the cabinet, are the whole story in the end. Everything else is just the road between them. We have 1 daughter. Her name is Sarah, and I love her past the edge of all reason. When she was a little girl too small for school, I'd bring her to the office on Saturdays, and she would sit on the floor by my chair and line up paper clips in long, careful rows, sorted by color silver and copper, and the red plastic-coated ones she loved best. I'd give her the old adding machine to play with so she could feel the keys go down and hear that satisfying little ka-chunk. And she'd sit there for an hour making her receipts, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth. Just exactly the way I do mine. I used to think this one has the head for it. She married a man named David Wilson the year she turned 28. Big handshake, big plans, the kind of young man who's already thinking about the next thing before you finished pouring his coffee. And I want to be fair to David because there is a great deal of him in this story, and I have had a long time to think it over. He worked hard. He wanted to be somebody. There is nothing in the world wrong with either of those things. But David always carried a certain idea inside him that the people who came before him had simply been doing it the slow, old-fashioned way, and that he was the one who'd finally come along to understand how it all really worked. He'd say things like the old model and the way business works now with a particular confidence that made it clear he'd already decided the conversation was over. He was not unkind about it. That was the thing. He genuinely believed it. He believed the way a young person can believe something without ever once having tested it, that experience and caution were just other words for falling behind. I remember about a year before everything happened, he came to me with a proposal. He wanted to move our accounting to a new software platform, cloud-based, automated, the whole thing. More efficient, he said. More modern. He used the word streamline 3 times in one sentence, which in my experience is a sign that a person has mistaken motion for progress. I listened to the whole pitch. I asked him a few questions about how the 2-signature rule would be enforced in the new system, and how vendor authorizations would work, and whether we'd still have a paper trail for the bank. He didn't have answers for any of them, but he had a great deal of enthusiasm, which he seemed to feel was a reasonable substitute. I thanked him for bringing it to me and told him I'd think it over. I was still thinking it over when everything changed. I only tell you this because I want you to understand David had wanted in that back office for longer than anyone knew. And he was patient, and he was waiting for his moment. I'd like to tell you about an ordinary morning before any of this, so you'll know what we had. A Saturday in early summer 2.5 years ago. Robert and I went down to the market on Main Street the way we did every week. He bought tomatoes from the Hartwell girl, even though we grow our own, because he liked her people. We split a cinnamon roll on a bench and watched the town go by, and 3 different men came up to ask Robert about their roofs, and he answered every one of them, like he had all the time in the world, standing there in his good Saturday shirt, with cinnamon sugar on his sleeve, drawing gutters and downspouts in the air with one finger. Then we drove up to the church for the 10 o'clock, and I sat where I've sat for 30 years in the 3rd pew from the left behind the Caldwells. Afterward, I had to chair the hospitality committee because somebody has to keep that coffee urn from becoming a fire hazard, and for 20 years that somebody had been me. We came home, and Robert worked in the yard, and I sat on the porch and shelled beans, and the afternoon went gold over the mountains, and that was the whole day. I would give a very great deal to have that ordinary day back. You never know when you're inside one that it's the last of its kind. Because that summer, on an ordinary Tuesday, Robert had a stroke. It happened out in the lumber yard. He was checking a delivery of cedar, and he sat down on a stack of 2x4s and found he couldn't get back up, and he couldn't quite find the words to tell the boy on the forklift what was wrong. The boy did everything right. I have thanked God for that child more times than I can count. And he had Robert at the hospital in 20 minutes. Robert lived. I need you to hear that first, because I know how these stories can go. Robert lived, but the stroke took something from him and did not give it back. His speech came slow afterward, and it stayed slow. His right hand developed a tremor that gets worse when he's tired. There were weeks that first stretch when he couldn't hold a spoon to the end of a bowl of soup, when he could not have signed his own name on a get well card if his life had depended on it. But his mind. I need you to hear this too, because the whole story turns on it. His mind is all there, every bit of it. It simply takes him longer now to carry a sentence from the inside of his head to the outside of his mouth, and people who don't know him, people in a hurry, people who've already decided they hear the slowness of the words, and they assume a slowness behind them. They are wrong. I have been married to that man for 44 years, and I promise you the lights are all on. They just take a moment to reach the porch. I remember sitting with him in the rehabilitation center that first month, the 2 of us in a beige room that smelled of antiseptic and reheated lunch, while a kind young therapist held up a card with a picture of a cup on it and waited for him to find the word. And Robert, who used to charm 3 counties without trying, sat there working his jaw, and the word would not come, and I watched his eyes fill up, not with confusion, but with the pure frustration of a sharp man trapped behind a slow door. So I reached over and took his good hand and said, "Take your time, Keel. I've got the fort." And something in his shoulders came down. We got through it that way, the two of us, one slow word at a time. I drove him to therapy every Tuesday and Thursday, and I never once let him see me cry in the car. I saved that for the shower where the running water covers a multitude of sins. And while Robert was in that beige room learning to button a shirt again, somebody had to keep the store's doors open. So David stepped in. Somebody had to, and I was at the hospital most days, and I was grateful, truly deeply grateful that family was there to do it. He drove down from their house the morning after Robert was moved to the rehabilitation floor, and he sat across from me in the hospital cafeteria with 2 cups of coffee. Neither of us drank, and he said, "Linda, you don't worry about a thing. Just be here for Dad. I've got it." And in those first weeks, he did. He kept the doors open and the payroll running and the lights on. He brought in a new point-of-sale system, which I'll admit was about 10 years overdue. He hired Marcus, a 26-year-old with a business degree and a careful haircut, who did precisely what he was told to handle the day-to-day accounting. He was capable. He was present. He showed up. But there was one thing he needed that I had not agreed to give him access to the banking. He asked about 3 weeks in sitting across from me in that same cafeteria. He needed to be able to move money, he said. Pay vendors handle payroll float deal with emergencies. He couldn't be calling me every time a check needed cutting. It made sense. On its face, it made sense. I was exhausted and frightened, and I had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night since the stroke. And he was right that I couldn't be reached at every moment. So I said yes, but carefully. I gave him login credentials to the online banking as a temporary measure. I told him no major transfers without calling me first. I told him the 2-signature rule was still in effect, and the corporate resolution was still on file at First Savings Bank, and I expected it to stay that way. He nodded. He thanked me. He took the paper where I'd written down the credentials, and he folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, and the conversation moved on. What I did not know, what I would not know for 18 more months, was what he did with that access in the 3 weeks that followed. He called First Savings Bank. He told them he was the acting manager of Johnson Building Supply, that the owner was incapacitated, and that for operational efficiency, the company needed to consolidate its accounts at his own bank where he already had a business relationship. He presented himself smoothly the way he always did. He had documents. He was persuasive. And First Savings Bank, following procedure, doing nothing wrong by their lights, transferred the operating account. The new bank had no history with us, no corporate resolution on file, no record of any 2-signature rule, no Walt Hennessy at the other end of the line who'd known our names for 20 years. Just a new account, a new set of signature cards, and one authorized signer, David Wilson, acting manager. He did not tell me. He filed the paperwork, moved the account, and he did not tell me. And because I was not opening the bank statements, because I had handed over the login and stopped looking, because I was in a beige room 40 feet from a nurse's station, helping my husband find the word for cup, I did not notice. I have gone over this 100 times since, looking for the moment I should have caught it. And I have made my peace mostly with the fact that there is a limit to what a woman can watch when everything she has is sitting in a hospital bed learning to swallow. I was trusting family. I was trusting wrong, but I was trusting family, and that is not a sin. David ran the store through the fall and into the winter, and he ran it well enough that I had no reason to think otherwise. The bills were being paid, the doors were open, payroll went out on time. When I stopped by with a casserole with a question with a reason to be in that back office that used to be mine, David was always warm and capable, and somehow the conversation always ended with me back in the parking lot without quite having gotten to the thing I'd come for. It happened so gently that I almost didn't feel it. My login to the accounting system stopped working one morning, and when I called Marcus, said there'd been an upgrade, and he'd get me set back up, and somehow he never did. The bank statements stopped coming to the house. The vendor binder migrated to Marcus's desk. One afternoon I came by with a list of 3 questions about the quarterly filing, and David took the casserole with both hands and the warmest smile you ever saw, and walked me right back out to my car, and I drove home having asked none of them. I noticed Marcus once near the end of that first winter I had come by to drop off some paperwork, and he was standing at the copy machine, and he looked up when I walked in, and something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite. More like recognition, the way a man looks when he's just understood something he wishes he didn't understand. He opened his mouth, and then David came out of his office and said, "Linda, come in," and whatever Marcus had been about to say went back wherever it had come from, and he turned back to the copy machine. I have thought about that moment many times since. I think Marcus knew. Not all of it, not then, but enough. Enough to recognize my face when I walked through that door and feel the thing he was feeling. He was 26 years old, and it was his first good job, and he had decided or been persuaded that what he did not ask about could not touch him. I do not hate him for it. I have been 26 years old. I remember what it cost to know things. The last time I tried, I'd noticed a charge I didn't recognize and asked David about it. Plainly, he patted me on the shoulder the way you'd pat a dog that's gotten underfoot in the kitchen, and he said the words I want you to carry with you into the rest of this story. He said, "Linda, you don't have to worry about all that anymore. You've earned a rest." A rest. As though 35 years of keeping that business alive, of catching every bounced check and bad invoice and rainy month before it could sink us, had been a heavy bag I'd been waiting my whole life to set down. As though the kindest thing a person could do for me now was to gently take the calculator out of my hands before I hurt myself with it. So I let it go. For a while. I told myself I was only being proud, and that pride is a poor traveling companion at my age. I told myself the children were trying to help. I went home and I tended my tomatoes, and I kept my own little household books, which take all of 20 minutes a month, and I drove Robert to his therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I held the fort in the only fort they'd left me. But here is the thing about a woman who has reconciled accounts for 35 years. You do not stop seeing the numbers just because somebody has taken the numbers away from you. The habit lives in your hands the way a hymn you sang as a girl will come back to you, note for note in a quiet church 50 years later. The numbers were still there somewhere just under the surface of every ordinary day, and they were about to come up to meet me. It was the second week of October when the reason finally came. Robert had a good day, a real one, the kind we had stopped expecting, and so were twice as grateful for when they arrived. At lunch, he told a whole joke. One of his old ones about a preacher and a carpenter and a ladder, the kind of joke that depends entirely on timing and the precise placement of a single word at the end. He got it all the way there. Every beat in the right place, every pause where the pause belonged, and then the word landing clean and sure the way it used to when he could tell that joke in his sleep. We sat at the kitchen table and laughed, and then we both cried a little, because it had been the better part of 2 years since he'd been able to carry a thing that far without the words scattering on him like dropped nails. And when you have lived inside something hard for long enough, a small good thing can undo you faster than any bad one. That afternoon, still warm from the laughing, he asked me to do something for him. He wanted me to drive down to the store and bring home the binder of vendor contracts from the back office. He wanted to read through them. It took him a while to get the whole thought out, and I waited the way you learn to wait, not impatiently, not with that particular brightness people put on when they are trying to look like they are not rushing you. Just waited the way you wait for a kettle knowing it will come. And when it came clear. "My name," he said, "is still on the door." He tapped the kitchen table with one slow finger. "Still on the door, Linda. I want to read what I'm signing my name to." I told him I'd go right then. I think some part of me was glad of the errand. I missed that office the way you miss a room in a house you used to live in, not with drama, but with a low, persistent ache, the kind that only announces itself when you are not paying attention. It was a Sunday, so the store was closed and dark and quiet. I still had my key. Nobody had ever thought to ask for it back, which tells you better than anything exactly how little danger they believed I was a 67-year-old woman with a casserole and a lot of questions nobody wanted to answer. What was the worst she could do? I let myself in the side door and walked back through the dim aisles past the paint mixer and the rack of brass fittings to the office that used to be mine. The filing cabinet was right where it had always stood, and I found Robert's binder in the second drawer without even turning on the overhead light. 35 years in that office will do that the body remembers what it has done 10,000 times, even in the dark. And sitting open on Marcus's desk square in the spill of light from the one lamp he'd left burning was a stack of bank statements. I want to be honest with you about this moment because I have turned it over in my mind 100 times since. I am not a snoop. I have never in my life read another soul's private correspondence. But those statements were lying open in plain sight, face up under a lamp in a back office of a business that still had my name on the deed and my husband's name in gold on the door. And I have spent 35 years reading exactly that kind of page, and my eyes went to them the way your eyes find your own name printed in a crowded program. You don't decide to. It simply happens before the deciding part of you has even woken up. The first thing I saw was the balance, and the balance stopped me where I stood. Our operating account had always carried a cushion. A good deep one. Robert and I had built it on purpose, dollar by dollar over 20 years. Because in the building trade, you have fat months, and then you have a stretch where it rains for 3 weeks straight, and not one soul comes in to buy so much as a box of screws. That cushion was how we'd never once missed a payroll, not even the year of the flood. And now it was gone. Simply gone. The account was running near empty, leaning on the line of credit to stand up, and the line of credit which we had kept clean and barely touched for a decade was drawn down nearly to its limit. I made myself breathe. A low cushion and a drawn line could mean a dozen honest things. A big inventory buy, a slow autumn, equipment going out and needing replacing. I have been doing this long enough to know that the worst answer is usually just a math error wearing a scary mask. So I kept reading, and that is when I saw the payments. There was a vendor on that statement I had never heard of in my life. Piedmont Logistics Partners. And we were paying them not once, not as a one-time charge, but over and over every 2 weeks regular as a heartbeat of payment somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. Down the page 2 weeks apart, like a sound you can hear in another room at night and cannot quite locate. I had personally set up every single vendor this business ever had. Every one. I knew our freight company and the name of the dispatcher's wife. I knew the man who delivered our propane and the name of his dog, a beagle named Sergeant. I knew our paint supplier's birthday because I had sent him a card every November for 22 years. In 35 years, through every season and every expansion and every tight stretch, I had never once heard the name Piedmont Logistics Partners. And here it was, drinking $5,000 out of my husband's life's work every 2 weeks, while he sat at home learning to hold a coffee cup with both hands. I did not panic. I want you to know that because it matters. Something else came over me instead, something I had not felt in 2 years, and it took me a moment to recognize it as an old friend. Focus, the old, cold, clean focus, the kind that comes down over your eyes like a visor and shuts out everything that isn't the number in front of you. I have felt it 1,000 times at that desk. I felt it now standing in the dark beside someone else's lamp. I squared the statements back to the exact edge of the desk where I'd found them, so not a corner was out of place. I took Robert's binder under my arm. I turned off no lights I hadn't turned on. And I drove home at exactly the speed limit the whole way, both hands on the wheel, because the very last thing I needed that night was to explain to a sheriff's deputy why a 67-year-old woman was shaking behind the wheel of a Buick. I gave Robert his binder. I made his supper. I sat with him while he read, and I answered his questions, and I watched his face do the slow, careful work of a man going through his own contracts after 2 years away from them, the frown at a clause he didn't like, the small nod at something that was right, his mind working, his mind all there. I watched it, and I loved him, and I said nothing about what I had seen. I waited until he was asleep, his breath gone slow and even down the hall. And then I went to the basement, down to the banker's boxes, my paper graveyard. The thing they had all forgotten existed because to them it was just an old woman's clutter under a bare bulb, the harmless accumulation of a woman who didn't know how to let go, bless her heart. But here is what they forgot before David's bright new system, before Marcus and his careful haircut, and his cloud-based everything there was, my system. And I keep copies. I had every vendor invoice from before the stroke, every freight manifest, every canceled check, every piece of correspondence with the bank 7 years deep, and then some sorted and labeled in my own hand. And at the back of the third box in a manila envelope with First Savings Bank corporate docs written on the outside in blue ink was the corporate resolution Walt and I had signed 30 years ago. 2 signature rule vendor authorization requirements, both our names on the account and no one else's. Filed and stamped and real. I sat down on that cold concrete floor under that one bulb in my nightgown and Robert's old cardigan, and I started to lay it out around me. The old freight invoices in one arc, the recent statements in another, the corporate resolution set aside where I could see it. 35 years of paper spread out like fallen leaves. And I started to do the only thing I have ever truly known how to do. I started to reconcile. I worked the way I have always worked, slowly, in order one verified fact at a time. Column by column, vendor by vendor, the old freight costs against the new, the timeline of the account transfer, which I could reconstruct now from the statements, could see exactly when First Savings stopped appearing, and the new bank began, could see it happen in the space of a single month while I was 40 minutes away in a rehabilitation center helping my husband find words. I laid it all out. I followed where it went. Piedmont Logistics Partners, 18 months of payments, every 2 weeks, between $4,000 and $6,000 each time. I added it up on a notepad, and then I added it again because a number like that you check twice. 39 payments, $191,400. I sat with that number for a long moment in the quiet of the basement. Then I set the notepad down on the concrete beside me and looked at the paper graveyard spread around me in the lamplight. 35 years of honest work. Every invoice matched to every payment. Every vendor real and known and documented. And I thought, there is no Piedmont Logistics Partners in any of this. Not a single page. Not a single freight manifest. Not one bill of lading. Not one delivery confirmation. Not one thing. $191,000, gone into a name I had never heard, and not a scrap of paper to show for it. By the time I climbed those stairs again, it was almost 2 a.m. My knees had locked up something awful, and the picture I had built on that basement floor was not a picture I could live beside and do nothing. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I have always done. I worked the problem the slow way, the right way, one verified fact at a time. I couldn't get into the new accounting system they'd seen to that, however gently, but I found I didn't need it. I had something better than their system. I had the past, and the past does not require a password. I had a public library 3 blocks off Main with a perfectly good computer and a very patient young librarian named Denise, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and never once made me feel foolish for the things I didn't know how to do. It was Denise who showed me how to look up a business on the Secretary of State's website. She had it up in a minute and pulled a chair over and sat with me while I read the way you'd sit with a friend at a hospital. I have thought since that the whole thing might have gone differently without that girl and her beaded chain. Kindness from a stranger at the right hour is its own kind of evidence. Evidence that the world is not only the people at your own kitchen table. Here is what Piedmont Logistics Partners turned out to be. It had been registered as a company 18 months earlier, about 3 months after Robert's stroke. The registered agent was nothing but a post office box up in Asheville. No website, no phone listing. I asked Denise to help me look further, UCC filings, any public contracts, any record of the company doing business with anyone anywhere. She searched for 20 minutes, methodical and thorough, and came up with nothing. Not a single filing. Not a single counterparty. A logistics company that had never, as far as the entire wide internet was concerned, moved a single thing from one place to another. We were feeding it $5,000 every 2 weeks. I drove the addresses I could find an old woman in a Buick going slowly looking. The registered address in Asheville was a mailbox store in a strip mall. The management address listed on the filing was a unit number out on Highway 64 at a new development of storage condos, rows of beige metal buildings with roll-up doors, the kind of place that went up a couple of years back when someone decided that people with too much stuff needed somewhere nicer to put it. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a moment with the engine running. Unit 14B847, Highway 64. I looked at the number on the door, and I waited for it to mean something the way you wait for a face to resolve itself out of a crowd. And then it did. Thanksgiving. 2 years ago, maybe 3. David at the table, talking with his hands the way he does when he's excited, telling Robert and me about a new investment, a storage condo development going in on Highway 64 ground floor opportunity, get in early. Going to be a gold mine, he'd said. Sarah had looked at him with that particular pride wives have for husbands who seem to know things. And I remembered thinking with the small, mean corner of my mind, I'm not proud of where does a young man with 2 car payments and a mortgage get the money to get in early on anything. I sat in the parking lot and I thought about that. And then I thought about the amendment in the Secretary of State filing a second member, added 6 months after Piedmont was formed, name redacted on the public version. And then I thought about the timing Piedmont registered 3 months after Robert's stroke. David's storage condo investment made around the same time, maybe a little before. What I hadn't understood at the time was just how far in he'd gotten. He'd put down money he didn't have borrowed against the house Sarah and the children lived in. To do it the whole thing leveraged to the hilt on a promise that the units would fill and the rent would roll in. And the units had not filled. I remembered Sarah looking proud across that Thanksgiving table, and I had thought then with the small mean corner of my mind that I am not proud of where is a young man with 2 car payments getting the money to get in early on anything. The answer I understood now sitting in that parking lot in front of a roll-up door with the engine running was that he wasn't. He was drowning. And a drowning man will grab whatever is closest, even if it belongs to the people who trusted him most. I pulled out of the parking lot at exactly the speed limit and drove home. That evening I went back to the notepad and I wrote down the date Piedmont was registered. Then I called Sarah very casually about something entirely unrelated, and in the course of that conversation I mentioned the storage condo development on Highway 64. Wasn't that the one David had invested in a while back? And when was that exactly? Sarah said yes it was, and she thought it was, let her think, about 2.5 years ago. Maybe right around when Dad got sick. I said that sounded right. And I asked after the grandchildren, and when I hung up the phone, I wrote the date on the notepad next to Piedmont's registration date. 6 weeks apart. David bought his unit. And then 6 weeks later, Piedmont Logistics Partners appeared in the Secretary of State's records with a post office box in Asheville and nothing else. I looked at those 2 dates for a long time, and then I closed the notepad and put it in my cardigan pocket. And I thought I need to be very, very sure before I say a single word to anyone. And I am not yet sure enough. But I am also underneath everything a woman who has spent 44 years in a marriage, and before I went any further down that road, I needed to give him one chance. One quiet, private, unwitnessed chance to have an explanation I had not thought of. Because I wanted to be wrong. With everything in me, I still wanted to be wrong. I wanted there to be some dull and perfectly innocent reason that the old woman put gently out to pasture simply hadn't been told. So I did the foolish, hopeful human thing. I made a pot roast, the way I used to on Sundays when Sarah was small carrots and onions and the good potatoes, the house smelling the way her childhood smelled. I called and invited them for supper, nothing special, just family come when you can. And they came the way they always came when I cooked, and we ate around the table, the 4 of us, the way we used to before everything, and Robert sat at the head of it in his good cardigan and followed the conversation with those steady eyes of his. And it was almost for an hour like the ordinary world. After we ate, while Robert rested in his chair in the front room, I poured the coffee. And then I said it as lightly as I have ever said anything in my life, lightly enough that I could take it back if I needed to, and call it nothing more than an old woman's idle curiosity. David, I said I was down at the store getting your father's contracts the other weekend, and I happened to notice we'd taken on a new freight company. Piedmont is that I didn't recognize the name. Who are they? You know me, I always did like to know who we were doing business with. And I watched his face. I have gotten very good over a long marriage and a longer career at watching a man's face while his mouth runs to catch up with his brain. There was a flicker. Just one, and very fast, a small door opening and shutting somewhere behind his eyes so quickly that anyone who was not looking for it would have missed it entirely. And then the smile arrived warm and wide, and ready the smile he had ready for every occasion. "Oh, Piedmont," he said easy as Sunday morning. "Yeah, they handle our regional consolidation now. It's a logistics arrangement, Linda. It's honestly pretty complicated. It's the kind of thing that's changed a whole lot since you were doing the books. Marcus set it up. Saves us a fortune on freight." "Does it?" I said. "Still pleasant. Still pouring." "It's only that the freight line on the old statements ran about half of what we're paying Piedmont now, so I wondered how the savings work out in practice. And here it is. Here is the exact moment I want you to hold on to, because every woman my age has lived some version of it in one room or another, at one table or another." David did not answer me. He turned his head and he looked at Sarah. Not at me, at my daughter across my own table, the way you look at the parent of a child who has said something embarrassing in church. And he gave a soft little laugh, fond and patient, and just slightly tired, and he said, "Sarah, your mom's been at the Ledgers again. At the Ledgers again." As though my life's work were a nervous habit. As though 35 years of keeping that family fed were a confused old woman's hobby that the grown-ups had to manage around. And my Sarah, my girl, who once sat on that office floor sorting paper clips by color, who I once watched and thought this one has the head for it, reached across my own table and laid her hand over mine. Gently, lovingly, the way you'd settle a frightened animal. And she said, "Mom, you don't have to do this to yourself. You've earned a rest. Let David carry it now." That word again. Rest. I smiled. I said the coffee was going cold. I let them turn the talk to the grandchildren, and I asked all the right questions about the youngest one's soccer, and I sent them home at 8 o'clock with the rest of the pot roast in a dish. Sarah promised to return, and we both knew she'd keep. She hugged me at the door, a long hug, and said into my hair, "I worry about you, Mom. I do." And I told her I loved her because I did, and because it was true, and because both of those things were about to make everything that came next so much harder. Then I shut my front door, and I stood in my own front hall on the hall rug Robert and I bought in Gatlinburg in 1991, 67 years old, having just been patted on the hand and pitied for noticing $191,000 walking out the door. And I understood two things simultaneously standing there in the quiet. The first was that there was no innocent explanation. A man with an innocent explanation answers the question. He doesn't look at your daughter. The second was that I was not going to raise my voice. I was not going to weep at anyone or plead or rage or give a single soul the satisfaction of watching an old woman come apart at the seams. They had already written that woman's part for me, and I was not going to play it. I was going to do the one thing I did better than anyone they had ever underestimated. And then I was going to lay it on a table in the cold, clean light of day where not one of them would be able to look away from it. But first, I needed the last piece. The one I had been circling around for 2 weeks, the one I had known was coming since the moment I stood in that dark office beside someone else's lamp. There was one more thing I needed to find, one more thread to pull, and I already knew it was going to be the worst one. I went back to the store one more time. A Sunday again, the same dark and quiet, the same key in the same lock, the same walk through the aisles by memory. But this time I was not looking for Robert's binder. This time I knew exactly what I was looking for. The canceled check images, the wire transfer authorizations, the physical records of every payment to Piedmont. I found them in the file Marcus kept for vendor payments in the cabinet behind his desk. And I pulled them out and I laid them on the desk under the lamp one by one, and I looked at the signatures. My husband's name. Robert Johnson in that long, looping hand he'd had since he was a schoolboy, the R like a sail catching wind. Authorizing wire transfers thousands of dollars at a time to a freight company that does not exist. Signed on dates when my husband was sitting in a rehabilitation room not 40 feet from a nurse's station, working his jaw to find the word for cup. Signed in months when his right hand shook so badly I had to steady his coffee for him with both of mine. Signed when Robert Johnson could not have written his own name on a birthday card if his life had depended on it. And at the back of the stack, the one that made the room tilt the original wire authorization form for Piedmont, the form that had established them as a recurring vendor in the first place, the form that had started the whole machine running. Dated 11 days after Robert's stroke. signed with my husband's name in that same long looping hand. 11 days after the stroke, Robert had been in the ICU. He had not known his own name with any reliability for 3 weeks after the stroke. I know this, because I was there every day, and I held his hand through every one of those days. He had not signed anything. He had not been able to sign anything. Someone had taken his name, the name he spent 50 years making mean something honest in 3 counties, the name still spelled out in gold on that office door, and practiced it until they could put it on a piece of paper and start a machine that would run for 18 months without anyone looking twice. I sat down in my old office chair, the one that still squeaks exactly the way it squeaked in 1994, and I put my face in my 2 hands. This was no longer a story about a son-in-law cutting corners to cover a bad bet. This was forgery. This was a crime. And worse, so much worse, if anyone ever held those checks up to the light who did not already know what I knew, it would not be David Wilson's name they'd be reading. It would be Robert's. A sick old man, the public face of the company, the name on the door appearing for all the world to have signed off again and again and again on the systematic looting of his own life's work. They hadn't only pushed me out of the back office. They had left my husband standing in the doorway, holding the bag with his name on it in gold. I sat in that squeaking chair in the dark for a long time, long enough for the lamp to feel warm, long enough for the anger to come, and then slowly to settle into something colder and more useful. Then I squared the papers back to the edge of the desk exactly as I had found them. I put the files back in the cabinet. I turned off no lights I hadn't turned on, and I drove home, both hands on the wheel, already thinking about who I needed to see. I knew now that I had to be careful. Not timid careful. There is a great difference between the two, and it took me 67 years and one very long night in a squeaking chair to learn it clean. Timid is doing nothing because you are afraid of what happens next. Careful is doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right order, because you understand at last what is at stake, and you cannot afford to fumble it. I had spent my whole life being careful with other people's money. Now I was going to be careful with my own family's future. I went to see 2 people. The first was Walt Hennessy. Walt had been our business banker for 20 years before he retired. He was the man who had drawn up that corporate resolution with me 30 years ago. The one who learned early to talk to me and not to Robert about the line of credit. The one who once told me after a particularly complicated refinancing that I had a cleaner grasp of loan covenants than half the commercial lenders he'd trained. He still met me for pie at the Skyland Diner on the first Thursday of the month, out of pure stubbornness and a shared weakness for their coconut cream. We had been doing it for 6 years. It was the kind of friendship that doesn't require much tending because it is built on something solid, underneath mutual respect is what it is. And at our age, we both knew how rare that was, and neither of us was going to let it go to waste. I didn't lay the whole thing in front of Walt. I'm not a fool, and it wasn't his to carry. I just asked him in the careful, abstract way you ask a thing when you need the answer, but not the conversation, what a bank looks for when a healthy little business draws its line of credit down to the bone inside 18 months. Walt set down his fork. He looked at me a good long while over those half glasses he wears the booth going quiet around us, the way booths go quiet when something real is being said inside them. Then he said, "Linda," speaking strictly hypothetically. He let that sit. I let it sit with him. When a healthy company bleeds out that fast, in my 40 years I can count on one hand the times it was the market. It's almost never the market. It's almost always a person. I nodded. I kept my hands flat on the table and my face pleasantly still. And hypothetically, he said, if that company's operating account had moved to a new bank sometime in the last couple of years, a bank with no history with the business, no existing relationship. He paused, and something shifted behind his eyes, something careful and precise. That would be a thing worth knowing, because a new bank doesn't know what rules used to exist, doesn't know what was on file at the old bank, starts fresh. And a fresh start for someone with the right access and the wrong intentions is a very useful thing. Hypothetically, I said. Hypothetically. He picked up his fork again. He looked at his pie. Then he said without looking at me, Whatever this is, Linda, you document every inch of it before you say a single word to anyone outside this booth. And you don't let the person know you're documenting. The documenting is the whole ball game. A pause. And if there's a corporate resolution somewhere in your files from the old bank, the original with the stamps on it, you find that and you hold on to it like it's the last good thing on earth. Because it might be. I drove home from that diner with 2 things, Walt's words in my memory, and a paper napkin in my coat pocket that I had written 4 of them on so I would not lose the shape of them in the night. The documenting is the whole ball game. The second person I went to see was a lawyer. Not David's smooth young Kevin in his good suit, a woman. Her name was Patricia Vance, and her office was up a narrow flight of stairs above the hardware store on Main Street, which struck me as either an omen or a joke, and I could never quite decide which. She did wills and small business work and estates, and she had a county-wide reputation for being absolutely impossible to charm. People said it with a kind of warning in their voice, the way you warn someone about a road with a bad bend in it. I found it the most encouraging thing I had heard in months. I had been charmed quite enough for one lifetime. I was in the market for its opposite. I brought her a folder. My folder, everything I had built on that basement floor and at that library table assembled and organized the way I organize everything chronological within category, labeled in my own hand, the numbers checked twice and the sources noted. The reconciliation laid out vendor by vendor. The Secretary of State filing with its redacted partner name. 18 months of Piedmont payments tallied to the dollar. The corporate resolution from First Savings Bank original, stamped 30 years old and perfectly legible. And the canceled checks and wire authorizations, every one of them carrying my husband's signature on dates when my husband could not hold a pen. Patricia Vance read for 40 minutes without saying one word. I sat across from her with my hands folded, and I let her. I have waited out a great many silences in my life. This one felt like the right kind, the silence of a person working, not the silence of a person deciding whether to be kind. She stopped at the wire authorization form, the original, dated 11 days after the stroke. "Mrs. Johnson," she said without looking up, "on this date, where was your husband?" "ICU," I said. "Day 11. She set the form down. She looked at it for another moment. Then she took off her glasses and set them on top of the folder and looked at me. "I need to tell you something before we go any further," she said. "And I need you to hear all of it, because half of it is going to sound like what you want to hear, and the other half is going to sound like what you don't." I told her I was listening. "You could walk out of this office right now," she said, "and have the authorities looking at those signatures by Monday morning. You have the grounds. The forgery is documented. The medical records will corroborate. I can make one call, and this becomes a criminal matter before the week is out." She held up one hand not to stop me, but to keep going. "Here is what happens next. The business's assets get frozen while the investigation runs. That means payroll stops. Vendor contracts go under a microscope. The employees, how many ye? 7 full-time, I said, 2 part-time. 9 people waiting on paychecks, she said. And the investigation with forensic signature analysis and medical record subpoenas and everything that entails takes 6 months minimum. Could be a year. In the meantime, your line of credit is drawn down. Your operating account is near empty and the business is standing still. A small business standing still for 6 months in this environment." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "It might not survive it," I said. "It might not," she said. "And there is the other problem. David knows something is wrong. Not everything maybe, but something. You told me he nearly caught you with the freight cost question at supper. A man who knows something is wrong and then finds himself under criminal investigation has every incentive to move fast, to make things disappear, to find a lawyer who tells him exactly how to use whatever legal tools he has access to, including, if he moves quickly enough, a power of attorney he might convince your husband to sign before anyone stops him. I thought about that. I thought about Robert in his good gray cardigan with his slow words and his trusting face, and a man who had already forged his name 100 times sitting across from him with a document and a pen. My stomach turned over. So, Patricia Vance said. The forgery is your spine. The medical records, the corporate resolution, the 18 months of phantom payments, that is your muscle. But the spine only works if the body is standing up. And right now the body is the business, and the business needs to stay on its feet long enough for this to matter. She leaned back in her chair. Here is what I am proposing. You walk into the meeting they are planning. You lay it out the way you've laid it out for me, clean documented in order. You make it unmistakably clear that you have everything and that copies are in this office and will remain here regardless of what happens to you or to any piece of paper at that store. And you give him one way out that does not involve handcuffs, because a man with one way out will usually take it, and a man with no way out will burn the building down trying to find one. And afterward, I said. Afterward, she said, the choice of whether to pursue this criminally remains entirely yours. Nothing about this approach closes that door. The folder in my safe doesn't expire. She looked at me steadily. But I would be lying to you if I said the practical outcome, the money back your name back on the accounts, the business intact, is more likely through the criminal process than through what I am describing. Courts are slow, businesses are fragile, and juries, Mrs. Johnson. Something moved at the corner of that impossible-to-charm mouth. Juries have been known to feel sorry for a handsome young family man and his crying wife. I sat with all of that for a moment. Then I said, what do I need to bring to the meeting? She told me. She told me what to bring and where to set it and how to sit while I did it. And then she said the thing I have repeated to myself 100 times since the truest tactical advice anyone has ever given me in my life. She leaned forward over her desk and she said, Mrs. Johnson, right now that man does not believe you can count. As long as he believes that he will keep being careless and he will not see you coming. So you are going to walk out of this office and go right on being exactly the sweet, tired, harmless old woman they all need you to be. So harmless it aches. Until the day you decide not to be. I drove home that evening feeling something I had not felt since before the stroke. Not happy, it was too sad a business for happy, and I am too old to confuse relief with happiness. But steady. Light. I had it. I had every thread of it sorted and copied and sealed in a lawyer's fireproof box above the hardware store on Main. I thought foolishly that I had something else as well. I thought I had time. I did not have time. Because the whole while I had been quietly building my folder, David had been quietly building his. 3 days later, Sarah called. I knew the second I heard her voice that something had been arranged. There is a particular brightness a daughter's voice gets when she is about to deliver something. She has been coached on a brightness with a seam running right down the middle of it, and I have known my daughter's voice for 39 years. There was going to be a family meeting, she said, at the store, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, about Dad's health and about her words getting everything organized for the future so nobody's ever stuck. David had spoken to a lawyer. They only wanted to make a few things simple. What exactly is it they'd want us to sign, sweetheart? I asked. I kept my voice soft and tired and level, exactly the voice Patricia Vance had told me to practice. A little pause on the line. The seam showing. Mom, please don't make it a thing. It's a power of attorney for Dad, just so somebody can act for him if he can't. And taking your names off the business accounts and putting David's on instead so the banking's all clean and in one place. It's just paperwork. It's for your own good. You shouldn't have to be dealing with any of this at your age. I said I understood. I said I appreciated them thinking of us. I asked after the grandchildren, and when I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with my hands flat on the surface of it, and I saw the whole machine turning at last toward its final move. Now I had thought at first, sitting in that squeaking office chair weeks before, that a thing like this could somehow make a forgery legal. It can't. Patricia had set me straight on that the very first afternoon. A power of attorney signed today reaches forward, not backward. It cannot put a clean signature on a check. David forged a year ago, and it cannot unsteal a stolen dollar. A crime that has already happened stays a crime. But here is the thing she made me understand, and it was worse in its quiet way than if it had simply erased everything. David didn't need to make the past legal. He needed to make sure no one with the standing to ask about it was ever left in the room. Take Robert's name off the accounts. Hand David a power of attorney over a sick man. Get my name off everything. And the moment all of that was signed and notarized and filed, there would be exactly one person left on God's earth with the authority to pull those old checks, demand an audit, or call a banker and ask a hard question, and that person would be David. The two people who built the company would have no legal standing left to so much as look. He could paper the trail over at his leisure, retire. The line of credit quietly let Piedmont fade into the back of an old file, and there would be no one positioned to ever prove where a single dollar had gone. The forgery wouldn't disappear. It would simply be locked in a room that only the forger held the key to. He wasn't pushing me out because I was old. Not anymore. That had been the early reason, the lazy reason, the reason that required no thought. Now he was moving fast with lawyers and a Saturday deadline, because somewhere in the back of that quick mind he had started to suspect the one thing Patricia Vance had told me to guard with my life. He had started to suspect that the old woman could count after all. That was the hardest night of all of it. Harder than the basement floor. Harder than the squeaking chair and Robert's forged name. Because that was the night I stopped being careful for a few hours and just felt it. I sat on the edge of our bed after Robert had fallen asleep, and I watched him breathe. The good hand curled on the quilt, the bad one resting open beside it. 67 years old, watching the man I had built an entire life beside and across town, in a house I had helped them buy my daughter, was helping arrange the quiet, lawful disappearance of everything the two of us had made together. Not out of hatred. That was the part that sat hardest. I knew that even then. Because she loved her husband, and she pitied her mother, and pity I have come to understand this is a wide open door that a clever man can walk straight through carrying whatever he likes. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I thought about signing it. I did. I sat there in the dark and I thought, you are 67 years old, Linda. The business was a thing you and Robert did, and Robert is tired now, and you are tired now. Maybe you sign the papers. Maybe you keep your daughter. Maybe you keep those 2 little ones in your yard on Easter morning. Maybe you let the money go, because what is money next to having your family at your table while you've still got a table? I had the pen practically in my hand, in my mind. The piece of it was very powerful at 3 a.m. And then Robert stirred in his sleep the way he has stirred beside me for 44 years, and his good hand came searching across the quilt until it found mine, and closed around it, and went still. He didn't wake. He simply needed to know I was there the way he has always needed it, and finding me, he settled. And I thought about his signature on those checks. That long looping hand, the R, like a sail, forged 11 days after he was lying in an ICU, not knowing his own name. Forged 100 times on the slow theft of his own life's work while he sat in a beige room learning to bring a spoon to his mouth without spilling. And I understood, holding his hand in the dark, that signing those papers would not be keeping the peace at all. It would be the opposite of peace. It would be putting my own name down in ink right next to Robert's on the lie. It would be agreeing in writing before a notary stamp and God and everyone that I was exactly the harmless, confused old woman they needed me to be. And I have been a great many things across this long life. I have been a wife and a mother and a bookkeeper and a fool. And a woman sitting in a dark room wondering whether love is enough reason to let a wrong thing stand. But I have never once in 35 years signed my name under a figure I knew in my bones was wrong. I was not about to start at 67. Not with Robert's hand in mine. Not with his name still on those checks. I called Patricia Vance at 8 o'clock the next morning the moment I judged it decent. I told her about Saturday, the power of attorney, the account changes, the deadline. She listened without interrupting the way good lawyers listen, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually taking it in. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me a question I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Mrs. Johnson, I can file an injunction today and have the authorities looking at those signatures by Monday, and you may never have to sit in a room with that man again. Or you can walk into the meeting Saturday. It's your family, so it's your call, and I will back either one." A pause. "So I'll ask you the only question that actually matters right now. Do you want to win? Or do you want them to understand? And I thought about Sarah's hand laid gently over mine at my own table. "You've earned a rest, Mom." I thought about the paper clips sorted by color on the office floor a lifetime ago. I thought about a family being when you strip everything else away, just another set of accounts, and what it means to try to balance one instead of close it. "Patricia," I said, "I want to do both." There was a pause, and then that impossible-to-charm woman laughed just once short and surprised and almost delighted, the laugh of someone who had not expected to be pleased and found that she was. "All right," she said, "then here is exactly what you bring, and here is how you sit while you do it." Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. The conference room at the store, burnt coffee and new carpet, the room you have been standing in since the very first minute of this story. I wore the navy blazer I used to wear to the bank, the one I'd kept pressed and hanging in the back of the closet all these years, and it still fit near enough. I did my hair. I brought Robert in his good gray cardigan, the one that makes his eyes look kind, which they are, and I sat him in the chair beside mine and squeezed his good hand under the table, and he squeezed back, slow and deliberate. He knew more of what was coming than anyone in that room would have credited him for. I had told him the shape of it the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with our 2 cups of decaf, speaking plainly and without drama, the way we have always spoken to each other across 44 years of real things. He had listened all the way through without interrupting. Then he'd sat for a moment with both hands around his cup, and he'd said slow and clear, "Show them." That was all. 2 words earned the hard way. Show them. I brought one thing of my own. One plain manila folder held shut with a single rubber band. I set it on the table in front of me, and I folded my hands on top of it, and I waited. They were all there. David at the head of the table in his good suit, running the room the way he runs everything warm, certain already nodding at something that hadn't been said yet. Kevin, his lawyer, beside him with the leather portfolio open and papers fanned inside it, the notary stamp on the table in front of him, like a period at the end of a sentence. Marcus at the far end looking at the table as though he hoped it might excuse him. And Sarah, my Sarah, with a spread of documents already in front of her, and a pen lying across them, its point aimed down the length of the table at me like a small, patient arrow. David ran the meeting beautifully. I will give him that much. He talked about Robert's health in a voice softened with concern. Genuine concern, I believe, because David is not a simple man, and his feelings are never simple either. He talked about the importance of being prepared, of not leaving the family exposed, of making sure the right people had the right authority if things took a turn. He used the word protected 4 times. He slid his folder across the table, the power of attorney on top, the account change forms beneath the signature cards at the bottom, Kevin's business card clipped to the front in case we had questions. And then he sat back and he said it. The exact words. The words you heard at the very beginning of all this. "Mom, we think it's time you and Robert step back. Let us handle the money side. It's a lot for someone your age." Every head around that table nodded. They were so sure. They had been sure for 2 years, and nothing had given them any reason to stop. So I settled my hands a little more comfortably on top of my own folder, and I smiled the warm, tired, harmless smile I had been practicing in the mirror for 2 solid weeks. And I said gently, "Before I sign anything, David, may I ask you just one question about Piedmont Logistics Partners?" The warmth stayed on his face for a moment, the way warmth does when the thing producing it has stopped present, but cooling like a burner you have just turned off. "I told you, Linda," he said, and there was only the finest hairline fracture in the Sunday ease of his voice. "That's a freight arrangement regional consolidation. It's honestly pretty. I remember exactly what you told me," I said. Still soft, still pleasant. "That it saves us money on freight. That it's a logistics thing that's changed a lot since I was doing the books." I tilted my head, gently curious. Only the freight line on our old statements ran about half of what we're paying Piedmont now, so I did wonder how the savings worked out. David sat forward. "You're comparing LTL rates to full consolidation," he said, smooth and even and ready with it. He had thought about this. I could see he had thought about this, had a whole explanation built and waiting. "They're completely different structures. Apples and oranges. Marcus could walk you through it if you want, but it's genuinely... I turned to Marcus, gently the way you turn to someone you have no intention of frightening. Marcus, I said, would you be able to pull up Piedmont's service contract for me? Or a freight manifest from last month? Anything showing what they actually moved for us? Marcus looked at me. The look on his face was the same look I had seen at the copy machine 18 months ago, recognition and the cost of it. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked down at the table. The room was very quiet. "That's all right," I said. "I can go ahead." And I opened the folder. I did not raise my voice. Not once, not through any of what followed. I did not accuse a living soul of anything. I simply did out loud, and in front of all of them, the thing I have done quietly in a back room for 35 years. I reconciled the account. I laid the first page down and turned it so they could read it right side up, because I had nothing to hide, and I wanted them to understand that from the very first page. "This is the Secretary of State registration for Piedmont Logistics Partners," I said. "Formed 3 months after Robert's stroke. The registered agent is a post office box in Asheville. There is no website, no telephone number, no warehouse, no yard, no dock, no truck with that name on the side anywhere I could find in 3 counties. I drove the addresses myself. I let that settle. It is a freight company that, as far as anyone on earth can determine, has never moved any freight." The room had gone very still. Sarah's pen was no longer pointing at me. It was lying flat. I laid the second page beside the first. "This is every payment from our operating account to that company. Every 2 weeks, 18 months. $191,400 all told." I tapped the figure once the way you tap a number you want someone to really see, which happens to be, give or take, the exact amount by which the cushion your father and I spent 20 years building and our entire line of credit have been drawn down in that same period of time. The money did not evaporate. It is never the market. It is always a person. It went to a post office box in Asheville. David opened his mouth. "Linda, I'm almost done," I said pleasantly. I laid the third page down. Then beside it the corporate resolution Walt's bank stamp, still clear as the day he pressed it, 30 years old and still legible. "This," I said, "is the 2-signature rule. Filed with First Savings Bank 30 years ago in writing both our names on it. Robert's and mine, no one else's. Any payment over $5,000, any new vendor authorization, 2 signatures, both names every time. That was ironclad. That was the rule." I paused. "And these," I spread the canceled checks across the table one by one like cards in a hand I had been holding for a long time, "are the authorizations for the Piedmont payments, every one of them over $5,000, every one of them carrying a single signature." I looked down the table at the signatures facing up where everyone could read them. Robert Johnson, the long looping hand, the R like a sail. "Robert Honey," I said, "would you show everyone your right hand?" My husband, who had sat so still beside me through all of it, quiet and present, and watching with those steady eyes, lifted his right hand up from his lap and set it on the table. It shook. The way it has shaken every single day for 2 years, the tremor that climbs when he is tired or cold or under any strain at all. It shook in the silence of that conference room and the spill of the overhead light, and there was not one person at that table who could look away from it or pretend they had not seen it. "My husband," I said, and my voice was perfectly steady because I had done all my shaking in a basement weeks ago and had none left to spend here, "could not have signed his name on these dates. He could not hold a pen. His doctors will say so. His therapy logs say so. That hand says so." I looked down the table at David. "And so I have spent a good many weeks wondering who took Robert Johnson's name. The name he spent 50 honest years building in this county, the name that is still spelled out in gold on the door of his office, and signed it over 100 times to send money to a company that does not exist." Kevin's portfolio was already moving toward his bag. Quietly, carefully, the way a man removes himself from a fire before the smoke reaches him. He caught my eye doing it and stopped. I looked at him calmly. "Patricia Vance," I said, Has a complete copy of everything I have shown you this morning, and a good deal more sealed in her office safe with written instructions. She is available by phone if anyone in this room has questions she can answer better than I can." Kevin set the portfolio flat on the table. He did not put it in his bag. He also did not take anything else out of it. I closed my own folder. I folded my hands. I looked down the table at my son-in-law. David Wilson opened his mouth. And for the first time in the 17 years I had known him, 17 years of that man, always having something smooth and ready to say, nothing came out at all. The mouth opened and the silence sat inside it, and he could not find a single word to put there. I watched his face, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was not satisfaction and not anger, but something older and quieter than either the particular sorrow of being right about something you had desperately hoped to be wrong about. "David," I said, "I am not going to do the rest of this in front of your wife and your father-in-law if you do not make me. So here is what is going to happen, and I want you to understand that it is not a negotiation. Nothing I have ever put in a ledger has been a negotiation, and this is no different." I told him there would be no power of attorney, and not one name would change on any account now or ever, except to put mine back where it had always belonged. I told him my name and Robert's were going back on everything by Monday morning, and that I was taking the back office back starting today, not next week, not after a conversation today. I told him that Patricia's safe was not going to be opened, and that the folder inside it was not going anywhere ever, for as long as I drew breath. He would do well to remember every single day that it was sitting there. And then I told him the part that was mine to give, and not the law's. "You are going to pay back every dollar of that $191,400, I said. "On a schedule I will set in payments. I will track to the penny the way I track everything. I have looked at your storage condo investment on Highway 64, and I believe if you sell that unit, you will have enough for a substantial first payment. The rest comes from your salary on a timeline we will agree on in writing before you leave this building today." Something shifted in his face at the mention of the storage condo. Not surprised he had understood by now that I knew about the address. Something else. Something closer to the end of all the pretending. "And you are going to sit down with Robert," I said. "Not with me in the room, with Robert. And you are going to look him in the face and tell him the truth in your own words, because a man who forges another man's name owes that man the courage of a confession at minimum. You owe him that. Whatever else happens, you owe him that." Sarah was crying by then quietly, the way she has cried since she was small without sound, just the tears coming. "Why?" she asked me. Her voice was very small, and inside it was the question she had been carrying since the moment she understood what the papers on the table meant. "Mom, why would you give him a chance, after what he did to Daddy's name?" I looked at my daughter, my girl who used to line up paper clips on the office floor, who I watched as a child and thought this one has the head for it. I thought about the long winter we were about to walk into together, the one where she would need to find a way to live inside what she now knew. I thought about the two little ones who loved their father the way children love the only father they have ever had, wholly without audition. "Because you love him," I said. "And those children love him. And I have spent my entire life keeping this family's books, and a family Sarah is just another set of accounts. When you find a bad entry, you don't take a match to the whole ledger. You don't burn down 35 years to punish one terrible year. You correct it. In ink. Out in the open where everyone can see the correction. And then you keep going." I paused. "That is what the books are for. I won't tell you it became a fairy tale after that, because it didn't, and you'd be right not to believe me if I did. David sold the storage unit 3 weeks after the meeting. The sale covered most of the first installment. The amount came through on a Tuesday morning, and I logged it in the ledger and put the date next to it in my own hand, the way I have logged every payment I have ever received in 35 years of business. The rest came from his salary at a logistics company over in Asheville, the real kind with actual freight and actual trucks. It turned out he was rather good at the honest version of the thing. He had built a fake version of, which is the sort of irony that the Lord seems to have a particular fondness for. He made every payment. He has not missed one. He sat down with Robert on a Wednesday afternoon in November, just the two of them in the front room, while I stayed in the kitchen and found things to do that required a great deal of concentration. I don't know everything that was said in that room. I made my peace with not knowing. But that evening at the kitchen table, Robert reached across and took my hand, and he worked his jaw the way he does when a sentence is coming that matters, and he needs to bring it all the way home. And then it came slow and clear, and all the way to the end of it. "You saved it," he said. "You saved all of it, Linda." He looked at me. His eyes were very bright. "You were always the keel." Sarah and I went through a long, quiet winter. Months where she could barely meet my eyes, not because she was angry at me. I came to understand this slowly, and then all at once, but because it is easier at first to be angry at the person who showed you the truth than at the person who told you the lie you had been living inside. We found our way back to each other. It took time. It took being patient with her the way I am patient with a column of numbers that won't resolve. You don't force it, you just keep working, and eventually the thing finds its own level. Marcus stayed. He calls me Mrs. Johnson, and he asks me before he does things, and he keeps a small notebook in his shirt pocket where he writes down what I tell him. I find this deeply satisfying in a way I have decided not to examine too closely. I'm back in the office 2 days a week. I'm 67, not a fool, and the tomatoes will not tend themselves. Robert and I have our Thursdays at the Skyland, our coconut cream pie, our booth by the window, where 3 men still stop him on the way out the door to ask about their gutters. The cushion is building back slow and steady the way we always built everything, board foot by board foot. There is no fast way. There never was. And last Tuesday, Sarah came by with the 2 little ones and let them loose on the man at the paint mixer who has the patience of a saint. And then she came and stood in the doorway of the back office, under the door with Johnson still in gold. And she watched me work for a moment the way she used to watch me when she was small enough to sit on that floor, and she said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have listened to you." I looked up from the ledger. I looked at my daughter standing in the doorway, 39 years old, knowing what she knows now, and carrying it the way you carry things you cannot put down. And I nodded at the floor beside my chair. "You're listening now," I said. "Come on, come line up the paper clips." She laughed and she cried a little, and she came around the desk. And she did. That was Linda's story, and I have read it more times than I can count. And I'll tell you the part that gets me every single time. It isn't the moment she wins. It is the moment right after when she chooses to give him a way back in. That is a particular kind of strength, and I have come to believe it is the kind you can only grow into. It takes years. It takes losing things. It takes being underestimated so many times by so many people who are so completely certain that you stop needing any of them to know your own worth. Linda asked me to pass one thing along to all of you, and I am going to give it to you exactly the way she wrote it to me. She said they thought my age was the end of my judgment. It was the beginning of it. That slowness people see in us, the careful way we move the time we take before we answer that, is not the mind failing. That is the mind that has seen this all before taking its time, because it already knows where the trick is hidden. Don't you ever let anyone talk you out of what your own 2 hands already know. If Linda's story meant something to you today, if you have ever been the quiet one at the end of the table that everybody was so sure about, do me a kindness and share it with another woman who needs to hear it. You are not invisible here. You are most certainly not finished. I'll see you in the next story.